There is a scene I want you to imagine. A house in the evening, lights on, dinner is ready. The aroma of food fills the air. But there is silence, not peaceful silence, but a heavy one. A father is scrolling his phone. A mother is watching the clock. And in another city, their son or daughter is doing the same, scrolling, busy, distracted, independent, but somehow disconnected. And in that gap between them lies a question no one is asking loudly enough. Why do young people today avoid living with their parents? Not always out of hatred, not always out of disrespect, but often out of something more complicated. Let's talk about it gently, honestly. When we talk about young people moving away from parents, one of the most misunderstood words in the entire conversation is freedom. Freedom today is not just a desire, it is almost a psychological necessity for the younger generation. It is like oxygen, not because they hate their parents, but because they are trying to breathe in a world that constantly feels crowded with expectations, opinions, and judgments. In earlier times, living with parents was natural. The family structure was collective, decisions were shared, and individuality was not as loudly expressed. But today, the world has changed. A young person is exposed to multiple identities at once: student, professional, social media persona, friend, partner, dreamer. In all of this, they are constantly constructing who they are becoming. Now imagine that same person living in a home where every action is observed with care, but also with commentary. Where are you going? Why so late? Is this the right decision? Even when said out of love, it slowly creates a feeling of being constantly seen but not understood. And here lies the emotional conflict. Parents believe they are guiding children, feel they are being restricted. So, the young mind starts associating independence with peace. Not luxury, not rebellion, but peace. They think, if I live alone, I can make mistakes quietly. I can learn without explanation. I can grow without feeling judged. And so they leave. But what is often missed is this: freedom without emotional grounding can also feel empty. Many young people who move out eventually discover that freedom is beautiful, but it also comes with responsibility, loneliness, and the absence of immediate emotional support. Yet, at the core, their decision is not rejection of family, it is an attempt to protect their mental breathing space. And perhaps the deeper question is not why they leave, but whether homes today allow enough emotional air for individuality to exist without suffocation. The generation gap is not just about age, it is about worldview formation. Parents grew up in a world where stability was the highest priority. A job meant lifelong security. Respect meant silence. Discipline meant obedience. Life was structured, predictable, and linear. But today's young generation is living in a world that is fluid, unpredictable, and constantly changing. Careers are no longer linear. Social validation is digital. Identity is self created, not inherited. So when both generations speak, they are not just using different words, they are using different emotional dictionaries. A parent says, be practical. A child hears, don't dream too big. A child says, I need space. A parent hears, I am being pushed away. Even love becomes misinterpreted. Parents often express care through advice, correction, and concern. But young people, shaped by exposure to emotional language, often interpret constant advice as lack of trust. This creates a subtle emotional friction at home. Conversations become defensive. Silence becomes safer than expression. Slowly, the home stops being a place of dialogue and becomes a place of translation where every sentence must be decoded emotionally. And when communication becomes exhausting, distance becomes attractive. Young people do not always leave because they disagree with their parents. They leave because they feel emotionally untranslated. And yet, the irony is beautiful. Both sides are trying to love each other, one through structure, the other through space. The real challenge is not the generation gap itself, it is the unwillingness to learn each other's emotional language. Expectations in families are rarely spoken as pressure. They are usually wrapped in love, concern, and pride. But even wrapped gifts can feel heavy if they are carried every day. A young person living with parents often feels that their life is not entirely their own. Even when parents do not explicitly demand success, comparisons creep in silently: neighbors, cousins, friends, children. These comparisons are rarely meant to harm. In fact, they often come from fear of instability, fear of failure, fear of social judgment. But the impact on the young mind is subtle and deep. They begin to feel that their worth is constantly being measured, not just by strangers, but by the people whose approval matters most. This creates an invisible emotional scoreboard at home. Career progress becomes identity. Financial success becomes validation. Life choices become public evaluation. And when someone feels evaluated in their own home, they stop feeling emotionally safe. So they begin to withdraw not physically at first, but emotionally. Conversations shorten. Sharing reduces. Eventually, moving out becomes a way to reset the emotional environment. It is not always about rejecting expectations. Sometimes it is about escaping the feeling of being constantly behind in someone else's silent checklist. What parents often don't realize is this: young people are not afraid of hard work, they are afraid of never feeling enough. And when enough is never defined clearly, distance feels like relief. Privacy today is not just about space, it is about psychological survival. Modern young people live layered lives. There is the visible life, family, work, society. And then there is the invisible life, emotions, digital interactions, personal struggles, identity exploration. At home, however, these layers often merge. Everything becomes visible, everything becomes shared, everything becomes open. But emotional development requires boundaries. A young person may not be hiding wrongdoing. They may simply be processing emotions, relationships, confusion, or ambition internally. However, in many traditional homes, privacy is often misunderstood as secrecy. A closed door feels like disconnection, silence feels like distance, solitude feels like avoidance. But for the young mind, privacy is not separation, it is self regulation. It is where they think without interruption, where they fail without observation, where they feel without explanation. When this space is not available at home, they begin to feel emotionally exposed even in their own room. And so, moving out becomes less about rebellion and more about reclaiming psychological ownership of their time, thoughts, and emotions. Because without privacy, even love can feel overwhelming. One of the most complex emotional dynamics in families is the thin line between protection and control. Parents rarely intend to control. Their actions come from experience, fear, and love. They have seen more of life and naturally want to prevent their children from suffering. But intention and impact are not always aligned. When guidance becomes constant correction and care becomes constant restriction, love can start to feel heavy. Young people begin to feel that their life is being pre-decided, not maliciously but habitually. Over time, phrases like, "I know what is best for you," can slowly transform in the child's mind into, "My choices are not trusted." This creates emotional resistance, not loud rebellion but quiet detachment. They start making decisions independently, then informing later. They start sharing less, explaining less, asking less, and eventually living separately feels like the only way to experience life without constant interference. But underneath it all, there is often no loss of love, only a loss of felt autonomy. And when autonomy is missing, distance becomes healing. Emotional safety is the ability to express yourself without fear of punishment, ridicule, or disappointment. Many homes provide physical safety, financial support, and care but unintentionally lack emotional safety. In such environments, young people learn a quiet lesson. It is safer to stay silent than to be misunderstood. So they stop sharing their failures, they hide their confusion, they suppress their vulnerabilities. Over time, the home becomes emotionally functional but not emotionally expressive. And when emotional expression is absent, connection weakens even if physical proximity remains. Young people then seek spaces where they can be imperfect without consequences, spaces where they are not defined by their worst moments, spaces where they can say, "I am not okay without," triggering disappointment. This is why many choose to live separately, not because they want less love, but because they want safer emotional expression. And until homes become places where vulnerability is met with understanding instead of reaction, distance will continue to feel like relief. Every young person carries an invisible question: who am I becoming? At home, however, they are often still seen through older identities: the child, the dependent one, the inexperienced one. but internally they are trying to evolve into professionals, partners, individuals, decision makers. This gap between internal identity and external perception creates tension. Living under the same roof sometimes makes it harder to shed old identities. Every mistake is remembered longer. Every failure is referenced more easily. Growth feels slower because the past is always visible. So moving out becomes symbolic. It is not just physical separation, it is identity space. A space where they can redefine themselves without constant reminders of who they used to be. Where failure does not become a permanent label. Where success is not constantly compared. Where identity is not inherited but created. And in that sense, moving out is not about leaving family. It is about meeting oneself without interference.